Immortality. We've done death. Now we're looking at the alternative. The most famous article that basically spawned an entire industry, and I just looked it up, and apparently it's still going strong. I saw a bunch of articles from the 2020s about this famous article, is this article by a British philosopher called Bernard Williams. That's why it's not Bernard, because he's British. About this thing called the Macropulos case. And he's talking about a famous story of this woman, Alina Macropolis, who actually has gone by many names throughout time and is, 342 years old. And in the story, she has been keeping herself 42. He picked the age 42 when he gave this talk, because this article started as a talk that he presented in Berkeley, because he was at the time 42, so he picked that as the perfect age that she would want to be alive. But I think in the John Fischer article it says that the official age is like 37 or something. But anyway, she's been alive for a very, very long time, and in the story she stops taking this potion that's keeping her alive, and she chooses death over immortality. And Bernard Williams is arguing that everybody would, because immortality is not to be desired. So Fischer, I believe Fischer came up with this term, refers to Bernard Williams and other people who agree with him, which include Shelley Kagan. The Shelley Kagan chapter that I gave you to read, it's essentially an easy version of Bernard Williams's argument. It doesn't really add anything new to Bernard Williams other than being easy to read, because Bernard Williams is one of those philosophers where it's a hard read. I mean, he writes beautiful sentences, but they're hard to follow. So the Shelley Kagan one, if you've read the Shelley Kagan, you're getting Bernard Williams's basic point, or at least when he's talking about immortality. Because he starts off his article, Bernard Williams, responding to Lucretius's argument that death is not a harm to us. Remember, Lucretius was a Roman follower of Epicurus. So Lucretius lives, I don't know, a couple of hundred years after Epicurus. I'm terrible at dates. And is very impressed by Epicurus's position, but gives his own sort of versions of Epicurus's argument. And most famously, it's Lucretius who points out the sort of symmetry on either side of our existence. There's non-existence. So before we're born, there's non-existence. We don't exist then. And after we die, we don't exist then. And one of his points is to say, look, you don't care that you didn't exist before you were born, so you shouldn't care that you don't exist after you die. It's just the same. Bernard Williams does two what seems like slightly contradictory things. He starts his article by arguing against Lucretius. So in other words, saying that your death can be a harm for you, that your death is bad, or it's something that you are right not to want. That is, don't hurry it along. That is the perfectly correct view to take. And in that section of his article, he gives something like the deprivation account. He's writing in 1973, so a couple of years after a famous article called Death by Thomas Nagel that he refers to in the article, where Nagel gives probably the earliest version of the deprivation account, or at least the earliest modern version. So he gives a version of that, and actually it's a bit like George Pitcher's position, if you remember from the last unit, because Bernard Williams is talking about death frustrating our desires, and that was George Pitcher's view too, if you remember his article, The Misfortunes of the Dead. And desires play an important role in Bernard Williams's article, particularly this idea of categorical desires. So it's important to have that first section where he's arguing against Lucretius before he goes on to the second one. So first he argues against Lucretius to say death is bad, but then he goes on and says, but immortality is also bad. So his final position is that you should live, there is a perfect length for you to live, and you should live exactly that length and no more. Probably longer than our normal lifespans. So if we can extend our lives, into the maybe up to 200 or something, as probably, provided we don't destroy the world, probably rich people will be able to do fairly soon. But immortality itself is not to be desired. That would be, he says, immortality is meaningless, he says a couple of times, which we'll make a call back to when we do meaning of life, which we're going to do in later units. Okay, to sort of set it up, I'm going to read you a poem. And this is or at least a section of a poem. And this is a poem by probably most English people, certainly of my age, have heard of this poet. Poets aren't famous in general, but this poet was kind of famous in England. He's a poet called Philip Larkin. Not necessarily a good or a nice person. He died, I don't know, a few decades ago, and they found his diaries, and he didn't come out well after people had found his letters and diaries. But I think unquestionably a great poet. And it's a poem called Aubade. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. And it's about death. And it's interesting because it actually mentions the two alternatives that we're considering. He refers to an Epicurean argument as well as the idea that we'll live forever. So I'm not going to read you the whole thing, it's quite long, but I recommend you look it up. I'm going to read you until we get to the stuff about religion versus the Epicurean view. I work all day and get half drunk at night. Waking at 4 to soundless dark, I stare. In time, the curtain edges will grow light. Till then, I see what's really always there. Unresting death, a whole day nearer now, making all thought impossible, but how and where and when I shall myself die. Arid interrogation, yet the dread of dying and being dead flashes afresh to hold and horrify. The mind blanks at the glare. Not in remorse, the good not done, the love not given, time torn off unused, nor wretchedly, because an only life can take so long to climb clear of its wrong beginnings and may never. But at the total emptiness, forever, the sure extinction that we travel to and shall be lost in always, not to be here, not to be anywhere, and soon, nothing more terrible, nothing more true. This is a special way of being afraid. No trick dispels. Religion used to try that vast moth-eaten musical brocade created to pretend we never die. And specious stuff that says no rational being can fear a thing it will not feel. Not seeing that this is what we fear. No sight, no sound, no touch or taste or smell. Nothing to think with, nothing to love or link with. The anesthetic from which none come round. So what that poem does, I think, is illustrate something that Bernard Williams refers to at the end of the article, that it's non-existence that is sort of a subject of mortal dread for most people. As he says at the end of the Williams article, he says people, obviously he had a religious upbringing, perhaps Catholic, and people were always telling him about hell. And he said hell didn't scare him. What was scarier was non-existence. So hell was actually okay because at least he'd be around even if he was being tortured. That was when he was a kid. And he says I guess what he's saying is he understands why Lucretius has to give this argument that non-existence is not to be feared. Actually, he gives two arguments, Lucretius. The first one says that fear of death is a misunderstanding. It's fear of death is based on a sort of misconception that we will be around in death to regret not getting the good things we were getting in life. And of course we won't be around, we won't exist. So that was the first Lucretian argument. And the second Lucretian argument that we haven't discussed is that whenever you die, your death is the same length, because basically you're dead forever, infinity, and so the infinity doesn't change whenever you die. So it doesn't matter when you die because you're dead the same amount of time. And he responds to this by saying, well, but look, the first argument does admit that there are good things in life and that not having them is therefore to be regretted. And as he gives essentially something like Feldman's view that an early death is to be regretted because you can compare it. You can compare a short life to a long life, and the long life contains more of what is good about life. So, what the argument that he gives for why regretting life makes sense, regretting death makes sense, is that this is where we bring in the desires. He says, if I desire something, then other things being equal, I prefer a state of affairs in which I get it from one in which I do not, and plan for a future in which I get it rather than not. But one future for sure in which I would not get it would be one in which I was dead. To want something, to have desires, we may also say, is to that extent to have reason for resisting what excludes having that thing. And death certainly does exclude us getting that thing. If that is right, then for any of those things, wanting something itself gives one a reason for avoiding death. Okay. Now, in response to this claim, so what he's saying is, if you have desires, death will frustrate those desires. Remember, this is like what George Pitcher said. So therefore, death is to be regretted. Now, in response to this argument, the Lucretian could say, but wait a minute. A lot of desires are conditional. What does that mean? So think of, suppose, just to come up with a random example, suppose you're on a boat, you get seasick, so you desire seasickness medicine. You have a desire for seasickness medicine. That desire is just conditional on you being on that boat. If you weren't on that boat, if you were on land, you wouldn't have that desire. You wouldn't have that desire for seasickness medicine. You know, if somebody gave you seasickness medicine, it would be useless to you. So you only have the desire for seasickness medicine given your situation. So Lucretius could say, or maybe even a Buddhist could say this, that all desires are conditional on being alive, so that when you're dead, then it doesn't matter that you don't have the desires, because the desires were just because you were alive. And he gives an example, and William says there's something to this, and he gives an example of old people. He says, or at least some old people, some of the old desperately want certain things, so they have desires, when nevertheless they would much rather that they and their wants were dead. So, for example, I don't know, a very old person might want a catheter that doesn't hurt, right? That might be an important desire for them, but they would rather be dead and not have that desire. So it's not as if the desire itself gives them a reason to stay alive. They only have that desire because they're alive, but it's not a reason to stay alive. And if all of our desires are like that, then desire itself cannot be the reason why death is bad. So in response to this argument, Williams says, well, that would work if all of our arguments were conditional, but all of our desires were conditional. But, he claims, there are certainly plenty of desires which are what he calls categorical. That is, that the desire itself gives you a reason to stay alive, that having the desire makes you want to stay alive, and therefore death would frustrate that because it's an important desire. Now these categorical, he says obviously the most basic categorical desire would simply be the desire to stay alive, and he says we must have at least this basic categorical desire, because he says, think of somebody who's rationally considering whether or not to commit suicide and decides not to. Why do they decide not to? Well, it must be simply that they have a desire to go on. And that is a categorical desire, a desire that involves desiring to live. But he says that's not the only kind of categorical desire. It's just proof that there must be at least one. But actually, there are plenty of categorical desires, and Fischer talks about these in detail, like desire to write a book. Like if you're starting a novel and you get sick, you think, oh, I won't finish my novel. Believe it or not, maybe if you're not writing a novel, this doesn't make sense to you. But, or, you know, I'll never get to see my kids grow up. So you have a desire to be there when your kids grow up. That is a desire that makes you want to live. So it certainly seems like there are these categorical desires. And not only that, these categorical desires are what define us. That is the other important point about these categorical desires. What makes us uniquely individuals is, so remember when we're talking about personal identity, we were discussing what makes somebody a person. Okay, but what the further question is, what makes me this particular person? What makes me different from you? And it's our categorical desires. It's what we're interested in, what we really want to achieve. So, your categorical desires define you as much as your tastes do. So they would be your desire that society become more just, or that, you know, certain people win the next election, or that certain people drop dead. These are desires such that, and this is a very important point, if you can't imagine you in the future betraying those desires. So, for example, suppose you're a young revolutionary and you desire most feverishly that, you know, socialism be brought about. And then somebody says to you, hey, look, in the future, you're going to be part of the dictatorship. You're going to be a stooge for a dictator. Now, it's going to be a very cushy life you'll lead. You're going to be a happy stooge. You're going to be in with the in crowd and helping oppress the vast majority of the populace, but you'll be fine. You know, like being Putin's henchman or something like that. You would not be happy to hear that, because you would say, wait a minute, that can't be me. That can't be me in the future. I wouldn't do that. So if there is a person alive in the future, it's not somebody I recognize because of this change in the categorical desires. Okay, so he introduces the notion of categorical desires in response to Lucretius's argument that death is not a harm. So the first part of the article is him arguing that yes, death can be regretted so long as it frustrates your categorical desires. But then this notion of categorical desires that he's introduced to argue against Lucretius is then going to be used to argue that living too long is also bad, that living an immortal life is also bad. Oh, the old people example, yeah. This just reminded me. My gran, my dad's mother, lived till she was 99. And one of my favorite relatives, my gran, I always loved my gran, but she was prone to dark moods on occasion, and my dad used to take her to lunch every week into, right up to when she died. And he said towards the end, she would lean across the table and say to him, "I long for oblivion." So she would have been one of those old people that she had desire, she wanted to go out to lunch, but she would prefer not to exist. So that's an example of the conditional desires. All right, so now Williams's argument against immortality, using the example of Alina Macropulos, is that essentially there's a dilemma. In order for somebody in the future to be me and to be someone I want to be in that future time, so this is a roundabout way of saying, in order for living up to that point as that person to be something that is something I should want right now, I should or would want, two conditions must be met. The identity condition, it must be recognizably me, and the attractiveness condition. It must be a life that I would want. So the person, imagine you're looking through a time scope and you see someone in the future and it's identified as you. And you ask yourself, well, do I want to live to, this is 100 years in the future, let's say. Do I want to be that person? Well, one example where we don't think you would is a famous case from Gulliver's Travels. If people don't tend to read Gulliver's Travels anymore, it was considered a children's book, but it's a very subversive work. It's by Jonathan Swift, and it's where we get the idea of Lilliput. People have heard Lilliput. It's where Gulliver is this traveler who, hence Gulliver's Travels, who visits various countries. He makes 4 voyages in the book. The first one everybody's familiar with. It's when he washes up on the beach in this strange island called Lilliput where everybody's tiny. They made a terrible Jack Black movie about this part. And the famous scene is he wakes up on the beach and he's been tied down because all of the people of the island, the Lilliputians, are terrified of him because he's giant compared to them. But nobody ever goes on to the other 4 voyages. The second one is Brobdingnag, where suddenly he's tiny and everybody else is huge. And if you do actually read Gulliver's Travels, Swift, who is a great satirist, another famous work of Swift is called A Modest Proposal, which is always taught in high school English classes as an example of satire, because he said the modest proposal is that given that all these Irish people are starving, we should, and the babies are just dying, we should eat them, and we should turn their skin into gloves, because then at least they'd be useful. He's not serious, this is a biting satire, and he's exposing how inhumane the treatment is. But it's another classic work of Jonathan Swift. So you can kind of see the kind of guy he is. And actually, Gulliver's Travels is very satirical too, and it's basically misanthropic. He doesn't like humanity. Well, in Gulliver's Travels, long story short, one of the places he visits has people called the Struldbrugs. Now, the Struldbrugs are immortal. So Gulliver hears about them and thinks, wow, lucky them. But of course, the catch is they keep on aging. So they continually age, but they can't die. And when you find that out, you think, that's a curse. That's when you realize hey, maybe death is a release after all, because you can imagine looking at yourself as a Struldbrug 200 years in the future. Have you seen 90-year-old people? They look like walking skeletons. I mean, I love Bob Newhart. Bob Newhart is great, but if you look at him now, it's kind of scary. And imagine what he'd look just, 20 years further on. And then imagine 200 years. It literally would, eventually they would be essentially walking skeletons. And then they would stop being able to walk. So they would just be lying there groaning, longing for oblivion, like my gran near the end. That is obviously doesn't meet the attractiveness condition. Okay, so to avoid that, we set some conditions to our immortality. And here's where in the Fischer article, he talks about possible kinds of immortality. The one that most people want is where, well, actually, the one that I think Williams would say would be not a bad thing would be contingent immortality. And contingent immortality is where you can die. It's just that you don't have to. So you could kill yourself, let's say. Whereas necessary immortality is where you're indestructible, essentially. You cannot die. You're going to exist for all infinity. So contingent immortality means that you could exist for all eternity so long as you don't kill yourself, but you have the option of ending things. Whereas necessary, you don't have that option. And presumably, if you believe in an afterlife like heaven or hell, you think that it's necessary. You think that you are, once you reach the afterlife, you are indestructible. Like Plato thought the soul was immortal in this sense. It cannot be destroyed. What about that? And what about, what if we take away the feature that makes the Struldbrugs so terrible, which is that they age? So Fischer describes basically the idea of immortality that most people think of is, he says, he sets the following conditions to it. He says, I shall focus mainly on robust immortality. What he calls robust immortality is necessary immortality where you know that you're immortal. Of the atomistic, non-serial kind. In Star Trek Deep Space Nine, all right, I've instantly lost half my audience, what little I had. There's a character played by René Auberjonois, I've forgotten, anyway, quite well-known actor. He's a changeling, and the changelings are basically shapeshifters, and on their native planet, they all merge together in one giant pool, and they sort of lose themselves. And he's kind of a weirdo because he's separated from the puddle, and that they think that people like that are insane. One version of immortality would be if we all merge into one big puddle. That would be non-atomistic. But we normally think of atomistic because we want to continue being individuals. So atomistic, non-serial, in other words, serial would be if you live like reincarnation, if you live a series of different lives that aren't necessarily connected, in which the individual somehow is ensured eternal youth, does not deteriorate biologically. That's the notion of immortality that we're considering. So, what does Williams say about that? So, here is the essential dilemma that is at the heart of Bernard Williams' criticism of immortality. He says it's impossible to meet both of these conditions in an immortal life. Now, it's not impossible to meet these conditions in a long life. It kind of varies depending on your categorical interests. And for some people, the ideal life might be hundreds and hundreds of years, depending on the strength of your categorical interests. But immortality is forever. Infinity, you would exist for infinity. And infinity, that's one of the problems that is raised by other writers, other immortality curmudgeons. Infinity is just, our brains can't wrap around it. But let's look at the essential dilemma that Williams comes up with. So he says, in order for it to be me, in order for me to live forever, the person that is in the future has to be me. So the person living hundreds of years in the future has to be one and the same individual with me. And it's not enough just that they have the same body, or, it's the same living organism if we look at animalism, which actually, Bernard Williams, if he had a theory of persistence through time, it's a body one. Bernard Williams is also famous for giving criticisms of the psychological theory of personal identity. He and Parfit, who defended the psychological theory, sort of had a back and forth in the 70s. So Bernard Williams, if he had a theory of that, of what it takes for us to persist through time, it's our bodies. We have to have the same bodies. Now, obviously they can change, our cells can change, but it has to be the same bodies. Well, suppose it is. Suppose someone in the future, you could say, that body grew out of this one over hundreds and hundreds of years. That's not enough to meet the identity condition, because that just says, that doesn't make it importantly enough like me at my core. There is something that identifies me as the person that I am in a more individual sense, and that's having the categorical interests. So, in order for that person in the future to be me, they have to have the same categorical interests. If they've changed radically, then they're no longer me. Okay, but if they have the same categorical interests, if they have the same character, they're going to be bored. This is what happened to Alina Macropolis, and this is what Shelley Kagan does a good job of hammering home this point. Whatever you're interested in, you're gonna get bored of it eventually. It's just, suppose you love seeing movies. If you live to infinity, you can see all the movies. Okay, well, they'll keep making new ones. Yes, but you're still watching movies. I mean, there are things that you could, whatever you love, you can have too much of it. Kagan gives a rather trite example of chocolate, right? If you have, everybody loves chocolate, but if you ate it every day, and a friend of his says, I want to be immortal so I can eat Thai food every day. He said, really? Think about that. I love Thai food, but you can have too much of it. You can kill it. So, if you meet the identity condition, you're going to get bored. And think of, imagine heaven, because that's the immortality that most people consider. Most people are not thinking like Alina Macropolis. Most people don't think they're going to live forever because of some magic elixir. And, if they did, they'd worry, well, all my friends are dying, so I don't want to be around when all my friends are dead. All of those would come up. But, okay, let's talk about heaven. And most people, I think, imagine a heaven that is a bit like the good place, or, when it really is the good place, where you wander around perfect communities, but it's you. It's recognizable you. Of course, you'll clean up a little, and if you live to age 99 like my gran, she doesn't show up in heaven age 99. They de-age her to the ideal age, 42 apparently. Most people, if they picture immortality, that's what they picture. Well, let's take a sidetrack into the religious aspect of that kind of afterlife. When I lived in Arkansas for 3 years, met some very nice people, but didn't like it. That's why coming to Flint was actually a step up. and you can't say coming to Flint is a step up from many places. But while we were there, we had basic cable because it was the 90s and, you know, pre-streaming. And for some reason, there were a lot of religious channels on. And I was flipping through the channels, and I would always come across this woman with a giant pink wig, this televangelist with a giant pink wig. And as I was reading this stuff, I remembered her, and I thought, did I imagine that? So I Googled her, and no, I didn't. There she was. It really was giant pink wig. And if you want to have a look at her, her name was Jan Crouch. I think she died in 2016, but she was around a good old time. And she was giving this speech as I was flipping through the channels. And she said this, and I've told this anecdote many times, but I'm going to tell it again. She said, if you like peace and quiet, you're not going to like heaven, because it's going to be people shouting hallelujah at the top of their lungs constantly, 24/7, for all eternity. And I thought, wow, I guess I don't want immortality then, because that sounds hellish to me. That does not sound like heaven. That does not sound like something I would want. So if heaven was like that, it doesn't seem like it would meet the attractiveness condition. But wait, the obvious response to this is, well, you say that now, but once you get to heaven, which is what made her preamble, if you like peace and quiet, you're not going to like heaven, a bit stupid. Why would she say that? Why would you want to turn people away from heaven? That doesn't seem like the televangelist job. But, you know, the obvious response of somebody who really believes in this is to say, but you don't get it now, but you'll get it when you're there. You know, it's like people, introverts, before they go to a concert or a football match. You know, they think, oh, I don't like the idea of sort of merging with the crowd. But then you get there and you get swept up in it, and it's like, yay, and then you come away and say, wow, I could never have predicted it, that I love that so much. Well, why don't we say that about this heaven of where you're praising God for all eternity? You will become somebody who enjoys that. That's part of what it is to go to heaven. There, isn't that an immortality we want? And Bernard Williams would say, no. An immortality that we want has to be one that I would want now, because I want me to live forever. I don't want somebody to live forever that I don't recognize. So using the example of the heaven where it's like shouting hallelujah at the top of your lungs for the rest of infinity. Just presented with this, it says, that's not what I want. I would rather non-existence than that. It doesn't meet the attractiveness condition. But then if you respond and say, well, you will want it, you say, well, no, then it doesn't meet the identity condition, because that won't be me. My categorical interests have changed. Like, you ask the person in heaven, you know, do you want to find out what happened? Hey, they did another series of Better Call Saul. Do you want to watch it? And that person will say, no, I'm too busy shouting hallelujah 24/7. I'm not interested in that anymore. And then I'll know this person can't be me. Because I've got to know, you know, I will consume any Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul stories that you give me. And if there's someone in the future who doesn't care about that, it's not me anymore. So that's the suggestion, that in order to meet me, it has to keep your categorical desires. But if you keep the same categorical desires, like Alina Macropulos does, you'll get bored. They will exhaust themselves. Alternatively, if you keep changing, then it's not you. And for example, he refers, for example, the idea of who would want immortality through reincarnation? And reincarnation with memory wipes. So I, let's say, am somebody from the Stone Age, because that person died and they were reincarnated as someone who's reincarnated as me. And then when I die, someone will be reincarnated. They won't remember anything about it. Is that immortality? No, of course it isn't, because it doesn't meet the identity condition. There's no connection between me and that Stone Age person. What about then somebody who just lives forever but changes perpetually? So they become completely different people at various stages in their life. And an example of this is Tiresias from mythology. Tiresias was originally a woman who promised Apollo her favors in exchange for musical lessons, only to reject him afterwards. She was turned by Apollo into a man, then again a woman, under unclear circumstances, then a man by the offended Hera, and then a woman by Zeus. So she keeps getting changed between, and let's say, other parts of the story suggest they were blind at certain points. But, you know, all you have to do is change the categorical desires. Let's say your categorical desires keep changing. So, you know, you like heavy metal one life, you hate it the next, and you only want classical music. You're very conservative, and then you become radically left-wing. You know, you wouldn't get bored. So it would meet the attractiveness condition, but that wouldn't be immortality. That would just be a series of different people who maybe have vague memories of something before them. That wouldn't meet immortality, the immortality condition. All right, now in response, Fischer says he can meet the attractiveness condition because he says that there are different kinds of pleasures, and there are self-exhausting pleasures, and he says maybe things like climbing mountains or watching movies or doing philosophy are self-exhausting, but then there are repeatable pleasures like having sex and drinking cool, clean water. You never get tired of those. And he says, so they're a reason to want to keep living at every stage because you want those. Those give you pleasure, and you can always get the repeatable ones. And he says, why haven't philosophers discussed pleasures like sex and drugs and rock and roll? Well, or sex and eating and drinking. He says, because philosophers are essentially a bunch of up in their ivory tower, and they look down on the animalistic pleasures. But they're the ones that you'll never grow tired of. Do you think you never go tired of them? Well, I mean, I like the quote from Thomas Jefferson given at the beginning of the Fischer article. As Jefferson wrote to a friend, "I am tired of putting my clothes on every morning and taking them off every evening." Basically, existence itself becomes boring. I know, you know, Fischer is, I think, older than me. I guess I'm kind of amazed that he adds sex to the list, because old people, we don't like to think of old people having sex, do we? But, you know, if you never age, I guess there's no problem. So, you know, oh goody, I get to have sex again tomorrow. We'll keep you going to infinity, he suggests. I think Williams would say no pleasures are that repeatable. You're just not thinking through to infinity. Now, so Williams's main point is that you can't meet both of these together. If it is you in the future, you'll be bored. If you're not bored, then it isn't you, because in order not to be bored, your categorical desires will have had to change to such an extent that it's no longer you. If somebody's up in heaven praising hallelujah with this look on their face, that's not me, I'm going to say. I mean, because basically, as Shelley Kagan points out, we could be lobotomized, and so that we are literally like vegetables, only capable of feeling pleasure, and then would an immortality like that? Obviously, that person would be happy for all infinity. They would have repeatable pleasures of the wire into the pleasure center of their brain. Would we want that, though? would we recognize that unquestionably happy person living an infinity of happiness? Would we want to be that person? They're happy, but are they us? No, says Bernard Williams. They violate the identity condition. All right, Fischer adds a third challenge. He calls these challenges recognizability challenge. He says, and this is brought up by other writers, that that an immortal life would not be recognizably human. And I must say I didn't find these as compelling as the Williams stuff, so I'm going to go through them fairly quickly. That the shape of an immortal life isn't recognizably human. And a lot of these come from a philosopher called Todd May, so I'm going to read a quote from him. The human's immortal life would be shapeless. It would be without borders or contours. Its color would fade, and we would anticipate the fading from the outset. An immortal life would be impossible to make my life, or your life, because it would drag on endlessly. It would, sooner or later, just be a string of events lacking all form. It would become impossible to distinguish background from foreground. This sounds an awful lot like the narrativity complaint. So I'm going to go on to talk about that one. But before we get there, human lives are fraught. That is, what makes human lives valuable is the knowing that you're going to die. That's what makes life, that's what drives you forward, is knowing that you have limited time. That's what makes life precious. If you didn't think that you had limited time, there would be kind of no reason to get out of bed in the morning because you can always put things off. I mean, hey, fellow procrastinators, you need a deadline, right? You need a deadline to get anything done. And without a deadline, you don't get anything done. Infinity, there's no deadlines. And Martha Nussbaum adds that if immortality lacks danger, so you can't be courageous. A lot of the positive qualities that we see in us depend on responding to adversity that is a feature of mortality. And then without that, you know, I think people think this about angels, that angels are in some sense, if they believe in angels, you know, that they're in some sense inhuman, that they don't get it, that they're alien. And what happens if you become an angel? You become alien because you don't know what it's like to have to live and die. There's a movie by Wim Wenders called, it's completely blank. The sequel was called Far Away, Wings of Desire. Wings of Desire, which basically has an angel as the main character observing humans, and then he makes himself mortal in the end because human life is so much more interesting than angel life. And that's sort of making the point. Wings of Desire, check it out. I think they remade it. For God's sake, don't watch the remake. Narrativity. Narrativity, there's a philosopher, Maria Scheckman, who uses narrativity as a theory of personal identity, that what makes individuals themselves is their narrative. It's what binds our memories together. So it's sort of like a psychological theory, except you can't just have memories that are just one memory after another memory. They have to be situated in a narrative. And if you don't have a narrative, you don't really have a person. And this idea, a lot of people have this idea that lives, to make sense, have to tell a story, and all stories have to end. In response to this, Fischer says, well, what about the stories that your gran always used to watch that drag on for decades and decades, like All My Children and stuff like that? I gotta say, I don't take so basically he's saying you can have stories that are recognizably stories even though they never end. And I think, well, first of all, people in those stories end. So the stories are just, they're not actually one story. They're just a series of overlapping stories, but all within the series, there's endings. Characters have got to end. And if they don't end, you get bored of them, and they have to start changing them. And I've got to say that I have this with most series, except Better Call Saul, that I give up on them after a few seasons. Like, I only lasted to season 3 of Game of Thrones. Got a bit rapey for my tastes. And then I'm glad I did, because I saw the huge outcry when it got to the final season, and one of the outcries was that the character of Daenerys completely changed. So the only reason, what they did was they changed the character to keep the character going, because otherwise they think, what can we do with this character? I don't know, we've kind of run its course with this. I know, well, let's do a twist and change him completely. Well, that's when you violate the identity condition. So I don't think his response that, hey, you can have a series, an ongoing series that has narrative structure, I didn't find that very plausible. Infinity is fundamentally different. Again, Todd May says, what we've not really grasped is the temporal aspect of immortality. We have not yet come to terms with how long immortality really lasts. It is, after all, an infinite amount of time. An aspect of immortality that may challenge us as human beings is that our lives keep going on and on. Going back to Star Trek, not Deep Space Nine this time, I think it was an episode of Voyager. In Star Trek, they have these immortal beings called the Q. One of them is always bugging Jean-Luc Picard. And he's sort of a renegade Q, but they're essentially gods because they're so powerful. They can do anything. And there's an episode of Voyager, I can't remember what it is, where one of them has decided he wants to commit suicide because he's bored. And it sort of runs through all of these issues. All the other Q are very shocked that you would want to do, you know, why would you do this? You're immortal, you're a Q. And he says, because I'm bored. I just don't want to do this anymore. I've done everything I want to do, I'm bored. And I think when you really think about it, you cannot take immortality. Another piece of evidence. I show that philosophers love, that a lot of people love, but philosophers loved in particular because it was influenced by actual philosophers, and they cited living philosophers and held up actual philosophy books. The Good Place. I don't know if you've seen it. The basic idea is that I've already referenced it, is this idea of immortality. Well, spoiler alert, literally, if you haven't seen the end of it, you can stop the video now. But at the end of it, people have the option to go through a door and cease existing. And they're glad to have that option, and they take that option. They don't live forever because living forever is not for us. Now that made sense in the context of The Good Place, and that was the way they found to end The Good Place. So it's interesting that even in a show like that, these points are made. I think we've covered everything. Immortality, not for everyone.